Before we get started, I want to take a moment to mention this video's sponsor, PragerU. PragerU is a great resource if you're the type of person who really wants to roll up your sleeves and watch videos of people reiterating your existing opinions, provided your opinions aren't well informed and you don't hope to see them get that way. Basically, think of PragerU as a university, except it's not. But it does have a U in the name, and if that makes you consider a YouTube channel a school, then PragerU is the place for you. Now, you might say, that sounds great, Prophet of Zod, but as crazy as life gets, where do I find the time? Well, here's the best part. You can attend PragerU on your own schedule at your own pace. There's no homework, no grades, no research required of you or the instructors, and you don't even need to look up any citations because why would you when what they're saying is comforting, and also there usually aren't any. Of course, if you're watching my channel, PragerU is probably not your thing. So why did PragerU sponsor me? Well, it didn't. If you listen carefully, you'll notice I didn't say it was the sponsor of this video. I said it was the sponsor, which is nonsense, meaning I didn't make an actual claim because PragerU is in no way affiliated with me. Anyway. I recently got an email from a viewer suggesting that I address this PragerU video about parenting. It's a few years old, but it's come to light again due to some analysis by Zoe B., who does a great job covering the background, qualifications, and parenting strategies of John Rosemond, the professor of this specific class offered by PragerU, also of his connection to a hate group. I definitely recommend you watch it. This is a more direct response to the video itself, sharing my thoughts from the perspective of someone who, as a parent, ex-evangelical, and former Christian school administrator, is very familiar with conservative Christianity's authoritarian approach to parenting. Its teachings about things like sin and obedience to God introduce a lot of assumptions into parenting. Assumptions that can dig so deeply into your thinking that I had to spend years unlearning them after I deconverted. That makes this topic fascinating for me to look back on. And while I'm not an expert, I hope some of my thoughts can be helpful for current or future parents who are on the same journey I am. Or maybe even people who are still processing their own Christian childhoods. And for those of you who simply aren't interested in parenting, this video still touches on broad ways that Christianity impacts people's views of morality. Also, I pick on a PragerU video, and who wouldn't want to see that? Well, from what I see on Facebook, a lot of people I grew up with wouldn't, but that's another story. Joining me today is Shannon Q, who's probably better qualified than I am to address some of Rosemond's clinical claims. So what I'm going to do now is record myself pretending to say hi to Shannon, who will have recorded herself pretending to say hi to me, and I'll edit it together so it sounds like a conversation. Hi, Shannon.
Hey Zod! Well, I'm not a clinician. I do have a degree in psychology, and I'm a bit of a mental health awareness advocate and kind of a science communicator in the field. And as someone with a background in this subject matter who's also a parent, I have things to say.
Great, and I appreciate you joining me. If you're one of the few people who hasn't seen Shannon around, please go check her channel out. She has a lot of great content and has been practically everywhere in the atheist community. We've talked about collaborating for a long time, so I'm excited to finally have gotten around to it. That out of the way, let's let Rosemond start saying the dumb stuff we know he's going to say so we can publicly disagree with him.
When was the last time you heard a child referred to as obedient?
When was the last time someone referred to you as obedient? That's a weird question, right? And it would be weird if the first thing that came to mind when people thought of you was, wow, John sure is an obedient guy. That's because obedience is not a natural personality trait to compliment people on. We more often say we admire things like courage, intelligence, kindness, strength, and integrity, just to name a few. And while we don't often explicitly think of why, the reason is that they're pretty much inevitably beneficial, and many require a level of personal resolve or self-sacrifice that we admire. But doing what another person told you to isn't always good and doesn't necessarily require strength of character. To vividly illustrate why, consider what enters your head when you hear the phrase, "so-and-so is an obedient German." That's why admiring a person for being obedient sounds jarringly strange. So why does John ask this question? Of course, obedience is more often a useful trait for children than for adults, since because of their inexperience and level of development, they need to defer to parental instruction and respond quickly in emergency situations. But it's not always good, and at best obedience is still just a reflection of and stepping stone toward other deeper personality traits you want to see a child grow in. So when people compliment a child for obedience, I see it being done for three main superficial reasons. 1. It's convenient for adults because it saves them from dealing with impulsive, rowdy, or unpredictable behavior typical for the child's level of development. 2. It saves the parent embarrassment and reflects well on their ability to keep their kids in line, making this more a compliment of the parent than of the child. And 3. Evangelical Christianity, where this mentality seems most prevalent, seems to see obedience as an end goal in and of itself, possibly because it sees disobedience as a sin that must be resolved rather than just behavior with an array of consequences, and it misunderstands morality as compliance with God. That's a longer reaction than I thought I'd have to this initial question, but the fact that he asks it says a lot about the underlying problems of where this video is coming from.
It's probably been a while. That's too bad, because the best research tells us that obedient children are happy children. And from my experience as a family psychologist, the parents of obedient children are happy parents.
Well, yeah, obviously the parents might be happy for fairly superficial reasons. But the children themselves? I guess I could see how, if parents set healthy guidelines and everybody generally abides by them, the framework is in place for a harmonious home life that would help them feel secure and happy. But obedience itself is just one piece in a much bigger puzzle. And in fact, it seems cooperation, rather than obedience, is the real constructive trait that's being learned, even if part of it involves deference to someone who has more experience than you do. The closest thing I can see to a kernel of truth in what John's saying is that kids are happier in a cooperative environment than a hostile one. Glad we've cleared that up. But remove other elements of that environment, and it should quickly become plain that the obedience itself is not causing happiness. For example, would obedience to an abusive, overbearing, or drastically inconsistent parent lead to anything but helplessness and pent-up frustration? Would being obedient while your siblings were allowed to run wild make you happy? It seems like John just kind of slips this in knowing he needs an obligatory justification for obedience as an end goal, and he knows his audience will pretty much accept it. I don't know. I'm just shooting from the hip here. So Shannon, do you have any more informed thoughts about this?
Oh yeah, I have many. I'm a massive proponent of source methodology. So I started looking through studies to support the assertion that the best research tells us that obedient children are happy children. Unsurprisingly, I wasn't able to find very much research directly measuring those two vectors. And I can also tell you why that's likely the case. Most parenting strategies prior to the mid-20th century leaned heavily on authoritarian structures of behavioral control. In the 1960s, a man named Stanley Milgram did some experiments on obedience that changed the way the entire field of psychology approached the subject, especially regarding installation of obedience as an imperative in parenting. But why, right? Why wouldn't we want obedient children? Well, it's not that we don't want children to obey technically. It's that we want them to understand why they should. Because as a parent, it's not our job to cultivate an attitude of blind obedience. It's our job to raise children who understand consequences and are able to reason through their actions. But back to Milgram. Milgram's research showed that in adults, when encouraged by a figure of perceived authority, the tendency to engage in deplorable acts increased at an exponential level. Milgram created an experiment where one adult was to shock another if they answered a question wrong. These shocks would increase as the study progressed. Unbeknownst to the subjects giving the shocks, they were shocking no one, and their counterparts were actors. The true test was, how far would they go? Turns out that when an authority figure was in the room with them, telling them to continue, they would keep going, even when the person they thought they were shocking was in clear physical distress. Even when told that the person they were shocking had a heart condition, even when they screamed in pain, they'd keep going because they obeyed. So we had to rethink what instills that in people. What makes them susceptible to that type of influence? And is that the desired outcome we want for people and for society as a whole? And I can tell you for a fact that those subjects weren't happy simply by virtue of obedience being their innate response. They were devastated at what they'd done, and when debriefed, they were not happy. Obedience as a goal isn't laudable. It's relative to the outcome of the behavior that you're attempting to elicit from the person you are hoping will comply.
Since all parents want their children to be happy, the question becomes, how does one get a child to obey? Is there some trick to it? Well, there certainly are a lot of parents who think so. They believe that proper discipline is a matter of using the right methods, techniques, and strategies, what I call consequence delivery systems.
Yes. The Bible, for example, tells people to hit their kids with a rod. So it clearly thought that this specific consequence delivery system was effective enough to recommend to others.
Parents have been using these behavior modification-based methods since they became popular in the 1960s, seemingly to no avail. Would anyone argue that today's kids are more obedient than kids were several generations ago? I don't think so.
Somehow I doubt that the best way to track the behavior of children across generations is to ask a rhetorical question to give an answer that appeals to your audience's intuition. Great research methodology, PragerU. This is especially suspect when you consider we have records of people at all times across history saying that kids these days are worse than they used to be. Unless there's something I'm missing about youthful behavior actually getting worse in recent decades?
Oh my sweet Jesus. Is this ever a misrepresentation and a watering down of the entire field of developmental psychology? Oh my God. He's created this absolute false dichotomy that's devoid of any nuance or elaboration, where he presents the choices as, you either follow my unsupported assertion that instilling obedience makes children happy, or you do what the field says and they'll be sad and disobedient. He seems to be tangentially referring to behaviorism as a counterexample, which is utterly ridiculous since his strategy sets out systems of rewards and punishments to encourage behavioral compliance. And that's literally what behaviorism is. Just look up B.F. Skinner on the Google box to fact check me here if you'd like. And I mean, further to that, he just glosses over people like Bowlby and Bandura and Piaget and myriad other developmental theories that all feed the field and body of research, because if he actually exposed you to the nuance and complexity of the field, he couldn't distill it to this monolithic parody. He needs to create this dichotomy. Bad John, bad. Bad John, bad. Bad John.
The reason these methods and techniques don't work is that proper discipline is not a matter of proper methods. It's a matter of a proper attitude on the part of the parent.
How are methods not important? It seems like, as with anything else, you'd want to think about what does and doesn't work with parenting and try to make sure you're doing it right. I mean, how do you even talk about this topic without having an approach in mind? Remember, the Bible itself advocated for a method, and I don't see how John's going to get through this video without doing the same. So why is he suddenly pretending he doesn't have one? I can only speculate, but I'd guess he's trying to suggest that the very idea of methodical parenting just overcomplicates a simple situation, so that any blunt, stupid, and cruel advice he's likely to offer sounds more effectively direct.
What frustrates me here is that the attitude that you utilize to approach somebody whose behavior you're attempting to modify, in this instance a child, is in fact a type of method. He's trying to divorce it from the idea that it is a method by saying that it's simply an attitude. But when we're talking about interactions and behavior modification, that is a method. Otherwise, what other methods is he alluding to? He's alluding to methods of behavior modification that have to do with a more interactionary approach, where you ask a child how they're feeling, perhaps, or an interactionary approach where you will engage with the child using specific types of conversational or dialectic methods. But his approach isn't simply attitude. If it was just attitude and not wrapped in an approach, then it wouldn't be affected. It wouldn't be effective. It would simply just be approaching a child with a specific demeanor. And even that in and of itself is a method. That is you choosing the way you're behaving during this interaction in order to elicit a certain type of behavior from the child. So him saying that it's not a matter of method, it's a matter of attitude, it's like a contradiction in terms, because picking a specific type of attitude and approach is a method. That's what it is. So this is just a nonsense statement. It's a nonsense statement.
Let me illustrate the point. Let's say that for a week, I observed the classroom of a grade school teacher who has the reputation of being the best disciplinarian in her district. She consistently has fewer behavior problems than any of her colleagues. What is she doing? She's making her expectations perfectly clear, which means, first, she communicates in simple, declarative sentences. She doesn't use 50 words when she could use 10.
Just for point of reference, John has used 265 words by this point in the video.
The more words you use to communicate your expectations, the less confident you sound.
Also, by suggesting people use simple declarative instructions, he's articulating a method and technique for dealing with kids, which is weird because he just said you don't need to do that.
Second, she prefaces her instructions to her students with authoritative phrases like, "I want you to," and "it's time for you to." She says, "It's time for you to take out your math books and turn to page 25, as opposed to, "Let's take out our math books and turn to page 25, okay?" Third, this teacher does not explain the motives behind her instructions to her students. Why? Because she knows that explanations invite arguments.
Or sometimes explanations do what they're meant to do, which is, help people understand something better. I have to wonder why John's pissing all over the idea of explaining things, when not only is explaining an evidently useful thing to do, but guess what he's been doing during this whole video? Explaining things about obedience to his audience. In fact, here's a list of everything he's explained so far. I mean, yeah, it's all dumb and he explained it poorly, but it's hard to argue that he's against the very idea of explaining on principle. Of course, to be fair, he didn't say that explaining is never useful, so we're not looking at an actual inconsistency. But this just brings to light something worse, which is that John apparently does realize that explanation is a good tool for helping people learn. Look at you go, you pedagogical mastermind. But doesn't think it should be directed at children, which seems to indicate his goal is not to help children develop a growing understanding of their own feelings and actions, but just to train them to follow directives.
Call and response training a child is not the same as them understanding the reason for their behaviors. It's a parent or authority figure valuing the behavioral set over the development of the child. Through reward and punishment systems, you can train a child to respond in a specific way, but devoid of elaboration as to why that's an appropriate or a desirable behavior. You're not equipping the child with the reasoning skills to make appropriate decisions for themselves in the future. Instead, they're going to defer to authority to make those choices for them.
Exactly. And I'll agree with John that explanation can invite arguments, but depending on what kind of pushback he's labeling as arguments, it could range anywhere from asking clarifying questions to insisting you're wrong, with a lot of gray area in between. and this is where the real teachable moments of parenting arise. The fact that your kid is asking questions shows they're internalizing and processing what you showed them, and it gives you the opportunity to reach them where they are. It also often shows they want to communicate with you, which is pretty darn great. Responding to questions has led to some of the best conversations I've had with my kids, and I can't imagine being so eager to squelch the possibility of arguments that I cut off communication to avoid them. You don't have to indulge them if they're arguing just because they don't want to do what you say, and there's a point at which discussion needs to end. But helping your child understand constructive behavior while knowing where to draw these lines and when and how hard to put your foot down is where the real skill and hard work of parenting come into play. The idea that you just need to smack your kids down, literally or metaphorically, whenever they step out of line, reduces parenting to a lazy, straightforward response to undesired behavior that at best gives you the facade of on-the-spot compliance without teaching your kid any skills other than following instructions. Or getting away with not following instructions when you aren't looking.
Not to mention that this assumes that children are essentially just carbon copies of each other cognitively. If happy, healthy, and independently functioning humans is our parenting goal, we need to first recognize who it is that we are parenting. There's a wide range of neurodiversity, and a style formulated for and effective with one child may not benefit another. Pushing for this absolutist authoritarian-only parenting strategy ignores this to the point of just absolute negligence, in my opinion.
One thing I'll add as a former teacher is that you generally do want to use direct, conclusive language when providing procedural instructions to a class full of students. This is one of the obvious cases where the point of your instruction should be clear, and it wouldn't be fruitful to try rationalizing every decision to 30 students at once. Here we see the appeal of John's simplification. He dredges up the fear of uncertainty that goes along with parenting, or any form of leadership for that matter, and offers what appears to be a simple solution that can apply in any situation. This is why he chose a straightforward crowd management scenario that's extremely stressful and where the goal is simply to maintain order. The stress appeals to your fear, the order provides a simple goal, and a strict requirement for obedience provides a deceptively easy answer. It's kind of like a parenting infomercial. But the deception is in trying to present the specific tactic for the specific situation as an effective blanket approach to parenting. Hopefully you want more for your kids than to see them temporarily quiet and orderly.
Whenever parents tell me they're dealing with an argumentative child, I know that these well-intentioned people are explaining themselves.
This is bullshit. As a longtime parent and educator, I'll tell you there's nothing you can do to ensure a child stops being argumentative. Some are to some extent by nature no matter what you do. And by the way, being argumentative is just a manifestation of deeper personality traits that are partially a strength. Sure, it tests your patience, and a child needs to be taught how to restrain their own strength of will and when to use it appropriately. But properly directed, a strong will can be an asset going into adulthood. It wouldn't be good to excise it from the child's personality, and frankly you couldn't if you wanted to. Trust me as someone who had tried every direct, authoritarian approach in the Christian playbook on a strong-willed child. The fact that this guy thinks an argumentative child always comes from something parents do, and that he knows exactly what it is, tells me that he's either totally ignorant about children, or is just a shameless charlatan.
They tell their child why they want him to pick up his toys, for example, and he argues. Because you can always pick apart an explanation. If you don't explain yourself when you give an instruction to a child, then the child, being a child, is almost surely going to ask for one. He's going to ask, why? Or why not? At which point, get ready for a big surprise. Your answer should be, because I said so. These very useful 4 words, and no, they will not cause psychological damage to your kids. Quite the contrary, are a simple but powerful affirmation of the legitimacy of your authority.
That's the dumbest answer you can possibly give. In theory, it either trains a child to obey anybody who asserts authority, which I'm sure will never steer them wrong later in life, or has no long-term training goal at all and is just a way to achieve temporary control. More realistically, it just challenges a strong-willed child to a battle of the wills, with their only choices being to escalate the conflict or accept and quietly resent the fact that you dominated them. I'll tell you from experience that churches and Christian schools are filled with kids who were coerced into the second choice, while the few who persisted in making the first are ostracized and misunderstood. That's not a great dynamic, and I can't see why this answer affirms the legitimacy of your authority anyway. Authority figures are legitimate because they have positive intentions, along with the skills or experience that make them an asset to the people they're leading. Because I say so bypasses the very idea of legitimacy, instead just telling the child you want to dominate them and daring them to do anything about it. Of course, you shouldn't let kids stonewall you, and you don't always have to explain yourself in the moment. But fostering a long-term understanding that you give them instructions with their best interest at heart is still important, even if at some points it's time for them to stick a pin in the conversation and just listen for now. I don't know. I can't with this dumb answer. Shannon, can you keep talking about this so I don't have to?
If I must? Sure. Let's talk about how it won't psychologically damage a child. Just for like a sec, shall we? One of the entire branches of developmental psychology that John seems to just like ignore the existence of is related to studying attachment styles in children and their relationship to things like parenting. Now, some of the best research shows that authoritarian parenting styles lead to detrimental both current and long-term outcomes for the children. But unlike John, however, I have a citation for you. Here's a quote from a study on self-regulation from 2011. Authoritarian parenting results in the development of insecure attachment. Insecure attachment leads to the development of a low sense of self-regulation, which makes an individual susceptible to addiction, vulnerable to drug abuse. Insecure attachment, anxiety, avoidant, and fearful has a negative relationship with self-regulation skills. Poor self-regulation is an indicator of lasting problems related to drug and alcohol use. The findings of Model 2 were consistent with the results and confirmed them. Now, as Zod mentioned, this isn't to say that the odd "because I told you so" leads to poor psychological outcomes overall. What this tells us is that if your entire approach to parenting is authoritarian dictates, your child will have severe issues with self-regulation and parental attachment that will absolutely psychologically damage the child. Or at least that's what all the best research says.
Say it calmly. Don't scream it. Nothing good is ever accomplished by a person who screams.
Unless maybe something's on fire.
Last but certainly not least, when giving instructions to a child, do not, let me repeat, do not bend down to the child's level. Getting a child to do what he or she is told is a matter of looking and acting and talking like you have complete confidence in your authority. Bending down to a child's level does not look authoritative. It looks, in fact, like you're one movement away from being down on your knees in front of a king.
And when you pat a child on the head, you're only a few inches away from smashing their skull. When you wave at someone, you're 4 bent fingers away from flipping them the bird. This is dumb. Nonverbal communication is in the nuance of various gestures, not how physically close one gesture gets you to another one. Jesus Christ. Thoughts?
Many thoughts. I have many thoughts about this. Meeting children eye to eye isn't about lowering yourself. That's actually stupid on its face. Children are shorter than adults. That's just kind of a fact of the matter. So you have to lower yourself in order to meet them eye to eye. There's multiple reasons for this, including being able to read their facial expressions and have them accurately register your facial expressions, to hold their attention to you during the interaction. And also, eye-to-eye contact hugely facilitates bonding and comprehension. Avoidance of eye contact could be an important indicator of many things, and not for nothing, it does also make you less intimidating to the child so that they don't go into a heightened fear response and mentally disengage from what may be like a really important interaction that you're having. Also, encouraging safe eye contact in children is shown to increase their overall levels of self-respect and encourage listening skills. And I mean, who would want that, right? Who would want that? I mean, John, if you don't like lowering yourself, that seems like a you problem. I suggest that you buy your kid a stool to stand on, because everything that I just said is beneficial and something that a good parent would probably want. Though I somehow predict that you'd frame that as elevating the child, who should be in a lower position, because at this point it is clear to me that you see children as subordinates to be controlled and not as humans to be raised.
I know you've read somewhere that you should get down to a child's level when you talk to him. Well, all I can tell you is that there's a lot of really bad parenting advice out there, and that's but one example. Speak to children from an upright position. That causes them to look up to you, and that is a good thing for them and for you both. I'm John Rosemond, author and family psychologist.
Not a psychologist by most standards. Watch Zoe B's video for more on that.
For Prager University.
Not at all a university by any standard taken seriously by any qualified person ever. It's a fucking YouTube channel, and a dumb one at that. To be frank, this video was nonsense. But it's nonsense that appeals to a lot of people's intuition, as well as providing the false sense of security that comes from having easy answers to one of the biggest and potentially most anxiety-inducing challenges of our lives: raising children. I used to believe things similar to what's in this video. As a Christian, I thought disobedience was a sin. I worked at a school that taught that authority figures were God's representatives, and that students learned to obey God by, I guess, practicing being obedient to us. This all stems from and reinforces an underlying idea that our ultimate goal is to grow in obedience to God. That doing so is not only the ultimate expression of morality, but the definition of morality. And that disobeying was a direct affront to God that stains your soul, makes you unable to stand in His presence, and, unless it's dealt with, removes His covering of protection from your life and ultimately puts you in danger of hell. When these are the stakes, then yes, you as a Christian are going to put a lot of emphasis on obedience and think that it's a virtue in and of itself. You might become neurotic about making sure that every act of defiance, every act of deception, is rooted out and dealt with before sin takes a foothold in your child's life. And you might have had parents that approached you this way. It's sad, but many of them might have meant the best. But we just need to, generation by generation and as a culture, grow out of it. If you can recognize this religiously rooted baggage for what it is and slowly learn to let it go, hopefully you can recognize that the goal is just to help your child develop into a well-adjusted adult. You can see their personality traits for what they are, recognize that they are assets in some situations and liabilities in others, and help them to make the best of their strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. This will get you a lot further than trying to shame them for and fully stamp out traits that are at the core of who your child is just because your religion casts them as sin. A defiant nature, while challenging, isn't necessarily terrible and can be a strength when tempered. Compliance, while convenient and a marker of a good child, can be a liability in many situations and can often just be displayed by a duplicitous and resourceful child. Developing this perspective and shedding the baggage that comes from a sin-based view of behavior will relieve unnecessary anxiety, help you refocus your efforts on more constructive goals, and potentially enrich your relationship with your children. It will certainly show you that obedience itself is not the goal, and because I said so is not a good reason for it. For parenting or divine command theory. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, A Little Logic, Daniel Bostet, Nidemos, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.